Hi there, folks. Well, welcome to today's webinar. This is Key Performance Indicators in Human and Organizational Performance. My name is Robert Waterhouse. I'll be moderating or the facilitator for this session. Today we have Mr. Norm Ritchie and Mr. Rick Therio, who will be presenting on this topic. Obviously, this is part three of sort of a three-part series on this topic, and happy to have these gentlemen with us today here. And we will basically just get going here. A couple things before we get started with some interactivity. Make sure you guys are aware there's a chat feature at the bottom of your menu you can access for questions and stuff later on. And a few more people here to let in. And you can raise your hand as well for flagging that. That'll send a message to me, and I basically will address any issues that you might have. There's the participants pane. You also have a sort of a polling function, if you will, with respect to yes, no, slower, faster, if we ask some specific questions, which we will in a second. So basically, I guess my first question for you guys using that sort of participant feedback pane is, can you see the presentation and hear clearly? And so if folks could click on the yes, or if you're having problems, then click no. And we'll see what kind of feedback we get here from folks. All right, I'm going to get going here with just telling you a little bit about our two speakers today. So we have Norm Ritchie. He's been for 34 years in the oil and gas industry, basically split equally across exploration and production and consulting companies. Educated as a mechanical engineer at the University of Glasgow in Scotland. He has a technical, broad, multidisciplinary background gained through engineering management positions in numerous operating units and capital projects. I'm just bouncing back and forth here. We're letting some people in here as we go. Mr. Ritchie's experience covers the full hydrocarbon development lifecycle from conceptual design to shutdown and decommissioning. Since 1997, Mr. Ritchie has consulted in project management and enterprise risk management. As a director of 5PSI Group, which he co-founded in 2003, Ritchie provides consulting and training in performance measurement and improvement, principally in the areas of risk, loss prevention, safety, human factors, and organizational learning. And then we have Mr. Rick Therio, who has 38 years in the oil and gas industry and has worked predominantly in the drilling completions services side of the industry. He's educated as a petroleum engineering technologist. He's a Canadian registered safety professional, and basically his roles have allowed for the development of his skill set and the development of future leaders. And Rick's been very involved with the Canadian oil and gas industry and a lot of industry sort of initiatives, whether it be fit for duty, many IRPs, and a variety of other things going back historically for quite some time. So we both very happy to have these two individuals here with us today. So at this point, I will basically stop sharing and I'll turn the screen over to you guys. And you can pull up your presentation and we'll get off to the races.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Robert, for getting us started and allowing us this time on Energy Safety Canada's website. We're here to really talk today about how we demonstrate proactive incident prevention by use of key performance indicators. And we want to utilize leading indicators to assist you in managing your business to allow you to set expectations with your stakeholders, evaluate your means of accomplishing objectives, and sharing the results as comparative metrics across your business lines and geographies. And so the use of key performance indicators, which are also called KPIs, provides us a solid foundations for these efforts and has been proven in other industries. And we want to make sure that we're encapsulating and using the majority of that information across our industry to ensure that you are, on the leading edge and not the tailing edge of that. So I'm going to go through some of these slides, and Norman's going to do the majority of the talking. We have a few poll questions and some key objectives we want you to learn about today.
Hey, Rick, just a comment. Could we maybe turn off your video? We're just getting a bit of a lag there.
Certainly can. I'll turn that over to Norman.
Hello, everybody, and again, thanks very much for having us today. This is our third in the series, and just in case you're interested in the other two and missed them, they're available through the Energy Safety Canada website. So there are a bunch of traditional metrics that we use to at least somewhat reflect our performance in terms of safety and risk management. And on the screen here are a whole bunch of what we might call the traditional ones. We're not here today to talk about the traditional ones. We're much more interested in what happens when these metrics actually get really, really good, when organizations become super high performers when measured using these kind of metrics. So let's start off, I think, by looking at where we all stand. Rick's going to have a little poll for us here.
Excellent. And we have this, and as Robert pointed out, how to use your poll results. Just looking at your organization, what is your total recordable incident rate for your organization over the last year? And this doesn't have to be complex. We're just looking at, okay, give us a baseline to where you're currently sitting or where you think you're sitting within the organization. So Robert, if you'll launch that poll.
Yep.
So we did pull up some results from the last poll or for our last session, and just looked at what was it that the C-suite was looking for with results from your key performance indicators. Were they only looking at lagging indicators, or were they looking at leading indicators? And it was a fairly interesting data set in that more than 75% of the companies or the organizations actually were discussing leading as well as lagging indicators at the C-suite. What was also interesting in that discussion was the fact that those results were only applicable for leading indicators, and some leading indicators only in about 15 to 20% of the organizations. So we really felt that it was necessary to give you some insight as to what we thought some of the key performance indicators were that could be useful for changing the culture. And so it's an interesting poll result here when we can see that the majority of your organizations have a TRIR of less than essentially 60%, which is under 0.5. So great numbers as statistical results, and one that we're talking to the correct audience today when we're starting to look at how we can utilize key performance indicators to get you to that next level. Over to you, Norman.
Yeah, that's a really great result, because we are talking to the right people here. If we can get that poll off of the screen, that'd be great, and move on to the next slide.
Did it disappear?
Nope. I'm
No.
Share
relaunch polling.
Okay, it's off of my screen, but
oh well. Basically, assuming that I'm the only person afflicted by this terrible inconvenience.
You can turn it off on your own screen, Norman.
Oh, really?
Just X out.
All right. There we go. Yeah, so anyone else who's similarly incompetent to me, apparently you can X out of that if it's stuck on your screen. So the idea behind this picture is that 40 years ago or 50 years ago, things were really kind of terrible in the workplace, and many people were injured with quite quite severe, life-changing outcomes. And over those years since, we've actually got better and better and better. And that's evidenced by the poll results we just took, that we are, the majority of organizations, in fact, almost all of the organizations that are represented here today are below that 1.0 magic line that we've drawn on the chart here. And so all I've got to say is congratulations. Now what? What do you do now to actually get any better? And the reason this becomes important is that the numbers become very, very tricky when you get these kind of rate metrics below 1, and even more tricky when you get them below 0.5 and lower. So Rick, if you'll advance us, please. So I just want to talk a little bit about the concept of zero, and I'm actually utilizing my Goal Zero Be a Hero coffee mug today, which I use ironically. The reason I use it ironically is that when you delve into the concept of zero, you start to understand that there are some significant issues. A few questions though we can get out on the table up front here is, is it what you might call a philosophical goal that's worth pursuing? And my response to that is that sure enough, it's a lofty goal, but the awkwardness about it is that goals, even philosophical goals at the top of the organization, almost invariably turn into targets as they roll down the organization. And those of us who are in the safety and risk management priesthood can make a distinction between a goal and a target, but I can tell you that the vast majority of the folks in our organizations are not able to make that distinction. So it's an awkwardness about this that is almost inescapable. Is it quantifiable? And you'll be perhaps surprised to discover that it's actually very difficult to quantify, because there's no broad consensus really. Zero what? Zero what? We talk about zero recordable injuries, zero injuries at all, zero injuries over some threshold, zero incidents, zero near misses. It's a very, very vague picture, and there is, as I say, no consensus. Now, is it attractive as an organizational goal? And the answer to that is obviously yes. Yes, it is, because it's easy to count and it involves data that we collect already. And that's actually one of the unfortunate parts of it, is that we get kind of obsessed over it. But today I'm going to show you how you can avoid some of the pitfalls of the zero concept using statistics. Yay! Next. So it's a double-edged sword here. High performers move to low frequencies, low event frequencies, and as that happens, you get into a zone where the signal-to-noise ratio is just most unsatisfactory, and it's really difficult to discern real data from just rubbish. You get to a point where there's all kinds of questions about the statistical validity, if only because in most instances, the input data can be somewhat manipulated through, for example, case management and the hiding of minors. And then we get into situations where randomness creeps in. Any activity that we conduct in the workplace involves a certain amount of residual risk. And while we may have managed that risk to a certain level, which we regard as reasonable and acceptable, that doesn't mean that it's not going to go wrong. Every time we indulge in one of these activities where there's residual risk, which is every activity, we essentially roll the dice, and the universe decides the outcome of our dice roll. Because we're reasonably good at risk management, we tend to find the results being acceptable to us. But occasionally the universe will roll snake eyes for us, and we'll end up with a data point that goes into our statistics. So the timing of that is essentially random. So yeah, let me ask everybody a question. Does this look like zero? Is this a zero performing organization? What do you think? Yeah, kind of looks like zero, doesn't it? Okay, advance, advance. What about now? Is it still a zero organization? What's changed? What's changed? This is actually a real set of data involving an organization with about 3,000 people operating in a harsh winter environment. And that's one spike. Still zero or not? How do you think the organization reacted when this occurred? Well, I can tell you, and you probably guess already, that the organization went absolutely berserk when this occurred and started running around like a bunch of headless chickens trying to work out what to do. Next slide. Now, what's interesting about it is that when you look at this from a control charting perspective, any of you who've been involved in statistical process control will know what's going on here. Any of you have heard of Six Sigma, for example. That's essentially what's happening here. We're looking at the numbers behind here, and when we start to do this kind of stuff, we discover that the rolling average of this is well within 1 sigma of 0. Now, we all know, I think, that 6 sigma is a fairly tight set of tolerances. 1 sigma is a super tight set of tolerances. Next slide. So this one, you can see when you add some control lines to it, although there's not a whole lot of fluctuation, you can see that this one is nowhere near 0. What about the next one, Rick? How about this one? What do you think? You'll notice that the y-axis here has a negative portion, and the reason it has a negative portion is to demonstrate that the lower control limit is well below 0, and lower 1 sigma is right close to 0. Lower minus 2 sigma is right close to 0 too. So what do you think? Does this count as 0? Random fluctuations like this can be smoothed out using this method, and you can start to demonstrate that the performance that you have is statistically indistinguishable from 0. So next. I would suggest that any of you who are working in organizations where they have this obsession with 0 start to recouch it in terms of some kind of statistical approach to 0. You may aspire to absolute 0, but I would urge you to adopt the philosophy that if your 12-month rolling average on these kind of metrics is within 1 sigma of 0, it's absolutely impossible to see any difference between absolute 0 and where you are, at least from a statistically justifiable and defensible perspective. So get your rolling average down to within 1 standard deviation of 0, and you're good. You're absolutely brilliant. Now, there's a lot of information here, and I acknowledge that. Very quick summary of this, and I would suggest if you want to know more, I've written a paper about this. Hook up with me on LinkedIn or send an email, and I'll be happy to send you this paper if you want to explore it further. Okay, let's roll. So we hear a lot about leading and lagging metrics. And I want to challenge you, if you're someone who is interested in leading metrics, I want to challenge you to think really hard and philosophically about what that means. What does it mean? Is a leading indicator predictive? And if it is predictive, what's it predictive of? And again, we come across this challenge of being a high performer with low event frequencies, that if you're in that kind of ballpark and you think you've got leading indicators, then you actually don't have lagging metrics that you can, with any kind of statistical validity, use to support the value or otherwise of the leading indicators. So again, I've got a recommendation for you that you distinguish between a leading indicator and an activity indicator. Now, what I would call an activity indicator would be things like number of safety meetings completed, number of BBS cars completed, amount of training completed, number of management visits completed. These are activity indicators, which may or may not have some value in terms of looking at your overall culture. But if you're in a high-performing organization, there is absolutely no way you can demonstrate or defend any of these things in terms of a measurable change in the output indicator, which everybody seems to be obsessed with, which is injuries. So what we want to do with a leading indicator is measure what we're doing today to make tomorrow better than yesterday was. And I've got a suggestion for you, and that is to use a set of metrics that we've been developing now for many, many years, nearly 20 years, and they measure learning from stuff that goes right and learning from stuff that goes wrong and directly removing risks from the workplace. Now, again, we're not going to be able to see, if you're in a high-performing organization, you're not going to be able to see with any level of statistical defensibility the direct correlation between anything, including the metrics we're going to talk about here, and reduction in injury rate, because your injury rates are already so low that they're essentially random and determined by whether the universe likes you or not. Next slide.
All right, well, we've got another poll to just see which organizations are actually participating in a leading or in an improving or a learning organization. And so just go back to your polls and let's have a look and see what which part of this that you guys fit into. And if so far we have nobody that does not participate in a learning organization, so that's interesting. And some that may be giving it some lip service, and then others that have the KPIs or the metrics to be able to prove it. So it's a really close race on this one, Norman, where we've got basically we're sitting at about 45 to 54. So lots of people are talking about it and others are actually doing it. So all very good, interesting data points. And so if we'll stop it there, I think that's a pretty good one. So we've got
that's an excellent set of results. And I was hoping for a moment this might be the first time in our three webinar series where nobody chose one of the options. But I see we've got one poor benighted soul who's working in an organization that doesn't even pretend to be learning or continuous improvement. So this is great. So again, it just confirms that we're talking to the right folks here, and you all showed up for the right webinar. This is absolutely fantastic. Let's roll on. So let's talk about learning. There are two main types of learning opportunities. There are the learning opportunities that find you, such as accidents, incidents, near misses, any kind of problems with your operations, your logistics, your maintenance, breakdowns, non-productive time, downtime of all kinds. And you can represent this graphically to show the economic benefit of it. Here's you're off spending money to do something, and you hit a problem, and that problem causes delays. And when you click on your button there, Rick, you'll see that you immediately have lost some value and quite possibly some time. And of course, there's also value associated with time. And so these learning opportunities that find you, you do not want them to repeat. You want to nip them in the bud. And so that's one type. The second type are learning opportunities that you find for yourselves. So that might be design engineering improvements, lessons learned from activities, after action reviews. You may do your own R&D. You may read lots of excellent magazines, do experimentation. It may be that you go to training workshops or attend courses. You may mix with your peers, mentors, and just meet up new people with great new ideas. You may also organizations, industry associations, and events like this one. These are all sources of learning opportunities, and we can demonstrate graphically the value of these in the same way that we demonstrated the negative value of bad things. So you get to do something faster, then you've added some value. We want to do that again. If we've discovered one of these things, we want to learn that. And similarly, if we click again and again, and similarly, if we work out how to do it cheaper, then we've added a bunch of value in that case also. And again, we want more of that. So there's great value in learning. And every time you learn, you're essentially removing a risk from the workplace. And so that's what we're going to talk about measuring now. How do we get to a point where we're not just talking about being a learning organization, but able to demonstrate it and measure it? And so there's kind of there's a culture associated with that. Excuse me. And if we're going to be a learning organization, then we really have to, there are just a few things that we have to inculcate within the organization. And one of those is an enthusiasm to bring forward opportunities for the organization to do things better in the future than they've done previously. And that's step one. This second step is to work out what to do. And the third step is to actually do it or incorporate it. So if you're going to measure learning and sustained or continual or continuous improvement, then these are actually things that you want more of. And as we all know, what gets measured, you get more of. What gets measured gets managed. And so if we can measure then these things and make them important and reward them, then it's likely that we're going to see an organizational culture that is demonstrably learning, demonstrably in a mode of continuous improvement. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to measure, we're going to reinforce, we're going to encourage the things that we want more of. And as a result, we're going to have metrics that show us that we are a risk eliminating, continually improving, learning organization. Next. So we've been doing this for a long time, as I said, and we have these very simple metrics which measure the things we've just been talking about here. And this, as I say, lots of organizations have done this and seen the benefit of it. So here we have the first one, awareness. We call it the awareness index, and it's all about trying to learn stuff or bring learning opportunities or improvement opportunities to the organization's attention before they cause a loss. And so these, the improvement or learning opportunities that you find are better than the negative ones that the universe shows you. And so we want to have a better ratio of no loss to loss learning opportunities. The next part is about working out what to do about these things. And that includes stuff like, are they worth learning? Not all, if you've attended the first two webinars in this series, you'll possibly remember that we talk about significance and that there are lots and lots of things that we choose not to do because they're just not significant. They're not sufficiently major, either in terms of upside or downside risk for the organization to get all fussed about. And certainly they may not be sufficiently significant for us to increase our bureaucracy through more or more complex management systems or business processes. So the Solutions Planning Index measures that. And then perhaps most importantly, you actually do the stuff you said you were going to do, because obviously nothing has changed until you change. And so until you do something, you haven't done anything. I mean, all of these very obvious statements, but it's absolutely astonishing how many organizations do step one, do step two, and then never get around to doing step three for a whole range of different reasons. So those are three. The Roman number V there is 5. And so we multiply those three things together, and we get this thing we call the VPSI number, which is the sort of learning metric. It's a high level number that basically tells us how we're doing in terms of organizational learning and continuous or continual improvement. Then we'd been doing this for a while, and eventually discovered that we needed a 5th metric, which was just as well, really, because we needed to have 5. And we only had 4 for a while. But it turned out that, that once an organization gets into a mode of bringing pre-loss significant opportunities to the table, the sky is the limit. And so it actually, it was worth developing a 5th metric that reflected that much more vigorously and rigorously. Perhaps worth comparing with your own organizations that we've seen this minor incident metric reach up into the 50 to 1, 60 to 1 kind of ratios, which is just astonishing. That's saying that for every loss event of significance, the organization was bringing 50 or 60 pre-loss learning opportunities to the table, which is an absolutely spectacular culture if you can attain it. Next. So where do we start? That was 2 fairly long lists of learning opportunities, and it's a big elephant to eat. So one nibble at a time. And for that reason, generally, we recommend starting off with measuring how much we learn from incidents. Why? Why is that? Well, if you're even contemplating this kind of sophistication, this kind of level of sophistication of performance measurement, it means you're already a high performer. And the way you become a high performer is by being serious about safety and risk management. So one might expect, or one might deduce from that, that you are serious about safety and serious about risk management. And therefore, one might take a further step and say, okay, if we're serious about this stuff, then that may mean, or should mean, that our response, our level of learning from safety or risk-related events should be one of our highest fidelity or highest integrity responses to any kind of learning opportunity. So it's a bellwether, if you will. If your organization is serious about risk management and safety, then the way your organization learns or purports to learn from these kind of events should be a very, very good indicator of your best performance against learning opportunities. So, Paul.
Excellent. So we're going to check in with the audience, and we want to ask this poll, and we're going to, how do you evaluate the quality of corrective actions after an incident? So your choices are, we do not, the HSE department decides, there's a management group or a team that decides, or we actually have a complicated systematic scoring system. And so we're watching this go, and it looks like there's management teams or groups that help to evaluate that, or the HSE group does. There's even a small faction that do not evaluate corrective actions after an incident. And so, we've got one respondent who actually says that they've got a scoring system. So very good on that one. So we've got a matter of about 20, maybe 30 people who have responded so far. So there's a few more out there who could vote if you're interested. And we'll leave that open for another few seconds, because it's interesting to see how many people actually do evaluate corrective actions. So let's stop that poll there. And it looks like we've got management groups or teams that go ahead and actually evaluate the corrective actions for that. So Norman, we'll carry on from there.
Yeah, that's really great, because you know, most people then have got at least the beginnings of a foundation for building some learning metrics here, because they've already got in place review mechanisms, and whoever that one person is at the bottom there, everybody needs to talk to them and find out how they're doing it, because this is essentially what we're talking about here. That if you can take the opinioneering is a word I made up to describe a technical discipline where the less you know, the more vehement you are in pushing forward your opinion. The problem with either review by HSE teams or review by management teams is that there is a lack of consistency there, and it's kind of hard to build metrics off of that. But we'll talk here now about a little way that we developed that you can do it. So, Rick. So the first thing we do is we kind of look at philosophically what is corrective action coming out of an incident. Corrective action is, at least theoretically, an opportunity to learn. But in order to be a corrective action, you need action, and it needs to be corrective. And what that means is that something's got to happen, and that something has to be both relevant to and effective against whatever it was that went wrong. And it's a very simple test, at least theoretically, but it's an absolutely vicious, it's a brutal test, because the vast majority of actions that come out of incident investigations do not meet this philosophical definition for various reasons. Either because they're not relevant, and particularly in the case of human performance factors, or they're not effective in real life against the unplanned event, or in some organizations because there's no route to implementation, and so they're never likely to reach real life. So yeah, so if you apply this to each of the output activities that are presented by an incident investigation, and they fail this test, then we call that a zero. And here we have the beginnings of a structured metric system. Fails that test, it's a zero. So here's a slightly different representation of that in a tabular form. The reason we want it in a tabular form is we're going to use it, we're going to stick these 3 or 4 columns up against each action that comes out of an event analysis, and we're going to ask the question, P, are we happy about the people who are supposed to be involved in this? Are we happy that the responsibility is adequately defined, that the folks who've been given the task or the activity are competent to do it? And most importantly, that there's an adequate and appropriate authority behind this activity to actually turn it into reality. And interestingly, this is possibly the largest hurdle between recommendation and implementation, is getting adequate and appropriate authority behind it, signing off on it to say, yeah, we're actually going to do this. Then we have S, which is about when it's going to be effective. And then we have the E, which is about its effectiveness and relevance to the unplanned event in the real life context. And perhaps I'm sure many of us are interested in cause and effect analysis. We insist on a reverse cause and effect analysis here, And there must be a demonstrable cause and effect relationship between the activity that rolls out of the event analysis and the desired result. And if you can't demonstrate that, then it's not a real corrective action, and it attracts this big fat zero. So the next thing is that we assign a quality to the action. We've already talked about it. The lowest end of that quality scale, if it fails this test, then it's a zero. But we could have made this really, really complicated, but I'm a simple guy. So we decided that we could probably make do with 3 grades of actual corrective action. So we take a perspective here on how good we think the corrective action is, and I'll explain what that is in just a moment after we've done another poll.
All right, so we're moving right along here, and I have another poll for you, and it says, does your corrective action consider human performance? And we have the choice of no, yes, but only to address idiotic performance, yes, and considers potential learning, or yes, and integrates to our competency management system. So it does consider potential learning, it seems, from the majority of you so far, and it does integrate into your management system. But the other choices are, we may have a winner on this one, Norman, where we've got no one choosing at addressing idiotic performance.
Someone's going to do it just to annoy me.
So
no, cut it off, Robert, cut it off.
All right. So at that point, we will stop and go and talk about these things.
Yeah. So this is great because those folks who are down at the bottom there, they're talking about systemizing a learning, and that's actually what we want to try and achieve. So next slide, Rick.
Yep.
So let's talk about these, the scoring system. It's dead simple. It's super, super simple. Let's say you have a little fire and you learn something. So here's your little fire. Here's your learning. You implement that learning locally for today, and we call that a type 1. And let's say as a result of your little fire, you look at everything else you're doing at the same time, and you kind of bring all of those different projects or wells or equipment or whatnot to the standard, at least for today, and we call that one a type 2. And then let's say that we take that learning and we systemize it. Let's say that we embed that learning in a business process or somewhere in our management system so that it happens automatically throughout the organization anytime a similar set of circumstances arises anywhere in the world. And that's what we call organizational learning, and we designate that one a type 3. And so that's, there we have a scoring system that actually tells us how we're doing learning from the best quality learning opportunities that we've been shown by the universe through incidents and incident investigations. Now, you may notice that all of the type 3s are coming out of Scotland there. Glasgow, not Glasgow, Glasgow.
And I think that we need to change that up, Norman, and move that right over here to Calgary as the center of the universe.
Maybe so. You guys won't let me in. Anyway, so next, please. Okay, so we've talked about this a little bit. So what we've done by this process is we've essentially come up with a way of measuring how we're learning from stuff going wrong. And once we've done that, we can start thinking about learning from stuff that's gone right. And the same process applies. So just to reiterate, identification of learning opportunities before there's a loss, thinking hard about how you're going to do it, and coming up with a good implementation are the other 2. So I think we've said enough about this slide, right? So what is it telling us? Move on. What it's telling us is how we're responding to stuff going wrong, how we're learning from it, and what we're doing to remove risks from the workplace today. Next. Next. So it ranges between 0 and 300 for obscure and old reasons. And if the number turns out to be less than 100, it does not mean that you're breaking a lot of stuff or hurting a lot of people. It just means that your response to stuff going wrong is generally ineffective, wasteful of resources. The same stuff's going to keep happening. People are going to be submerged in bureaucracy. You're going to be not very good at, Rick, you're not keeping up here, man. There we go. The probability of stuff going wrong is no different than it was last year. May even get worse. Underreporting of near misses, and you're certainly not doing a good job of resolving underlying problems. If it gets above 100, between 100 and 200, next. Thank you. Then it means generally that you're coming up with temporary fixes, type 1 and type 2 actions. It means that you've got non-uniform effectiveness. There's volatility, what we call volatility, which is that you're not capturing your learnings in business processes and the management systems. You're relying on individuals and teams. And there's volatility there because particularly when there's a situation like there is right now in oil and gas, and people are being laid off left, right, and center, then if you're only in this range between 100 and 200, your learnings are going to disappear with all those people. Next slide, thanks. So what we can do here is we can come up with some performance goals, and we say, okay, you want to be a learning organization, you're going to need to have a VPSI number over 200. We want to have a high ratio of pre-loss events to loss events. So let's say 10 to 1. We want to have a high ratio of these type 3 systemic learnings. And another one that's important is we want to keep the number of actions coming out of each event low. And so using this process of measuring the quality of actions, there's absolutely no need to have any more than 3 actions per event. Absolutely no need. Sometimes we'll let you get away with 4, but absolutely, you have a type 1 to fix what's wrong right here, right now, a type 2 to look around and see if anything else is similarly situated and fix those, and then a type 3 to prevent it from happening again broadly across the organization. That's all you need. You don't need any more. And so there is actually a very sound economic argument for minimizing the number of actions that come out of any kind of learning opportunity, whether it's a positive or a negative one. And then implementation ought to be a continuous level of something like 90%. So let's say you get over 200 with your VPSI number. What does that mean? Well, it means that you get a smiley face on your equipment. It means that you're generally making problems go away permanently. You're reducing the risk. So the probability of stuff going wrong actually is reducing. It means that you're doing a great job of bringing pre-loss opportunities to learn into the organization for action. And really it means, it basically says you're a continuous improvement, continual improving organization, you're a learning organization. So moving on. So there's a problem here, which is that those of you who've seen the Matrix may remember the choice between the red pill and the blue pill. And what's interesting about this set of metrics we've just talked about is that they're unconventional. They present an insight that organizations do not have right now. And the news is not necessarily good. So the first thing that we generally will recommend to an organization is that you take a look and you generate a baseline assessment. And now remember that the VPSI number goes between 0 and 300, and these here are some typical baseline VPSI numbers for organizations that some of you work for and most of you have heard of. And you'll notice that they're not that high. Now, the highest baseline we've ever discovered was 62. And what's interesting about that is that it indicates that there's a very, very broadly seen issue with learning from stuff, opportunities that just pass us by, that pass almost every organization by. And so the challenge with this is that it's actually kind of, we come across all kinds of cognitive biases here, particularly the illusory superiority bias. And the folks that do this exercise end up going through the 5 stages of grief and often don't make it past anger. Anyway, so this is actually, even if your traditional metrics are really, really good, what this approach generally gives you is an opportunity to see room for further improvement that most organizations don't even know exists. Next slide. So how would this work? Well, here's what generally happens. You do this baseline, you go OMG, WTF, and then you decide to do something about it. And by instituting this as a regular set of KPIs, you see a step change in these metrics, and then you maintain them over that KPI performance threshold, performance goal that we talked about earlier. And what that takes you into is a zone of organizational learning, a zone of continual or continuous improvement, depending on which vocabulary you prefer. So that's what that's about. What's next, Rick? Yeah, so here's some real data, nothing particularly exciting there. Next. Oh, this one's, okay, this is a horrible table, but this was an organization that if you click through here, Rick, you'll see reports rated 3. Each one of these is a systemic change that removes a risk from the workplace. So over a period of 5 years, I'm an engineer, so I'm not very good at math, but that's certainly a couple of thousand risks removed from the workplace. And so although you cannot see any kind of a correlation, again, I'll go back to what we said at the beginning, you can't see a correlation between these metrics and any change necessarily in your traditional injury-based metrics. This in and of itself demonstrates the efficacy of this kind of measurement approach. Next. So these learning metrics, just quick bullet points here. It's about not just safety, not just risk, but generally getting stuff right and going forward getting stuff right. There are all kinds of economic arguments in favor of this kind of approach. It's a brand new insight in the way your organizational culture is operating. You are rewarding things you want more of, and these metrics are entirely under the control of the people being measured. And that means that they can be used as a bonus program that is not based on luck, which any kind of traditional injury-based metrics certainly are. Give you, as I said, about 1 million times here, platform for continual or continuous improvement, demonstrate that you're a learning organization. And I believe that's now we've got a few minutes for questions, if anyone's got anything they want to ask.
Yes, Norman, we have about 5 minutes worth of questions or 4 questions. And if you could please enter your question into the chat box. If you notice on the bottom of your screen, you should have the ability to select chat and then just type that into the chat box, and we will try and answer those questions.
One quick question maybe to ask for you while a couple of people think about some questions is, one of the challenges with this is leaders, and executives within many organizations, even, president level or higher, even board, are so tied to TRIF and things like that, that certainly that becomes a change barrier to, many health and safety sort of professionals that are trying to get their organization heading in this direction. Do you have any suggestions on that?
Well, I think it's plain to see that the traditional metrics are not going to go away. And one of the challenges that we have is at that very, very high level in the organization, the CEO's compensation, his variable compensation, probably has a TRIF facet to it. And we did a piece of work a few years ago and looked at 10 mid-sized oil companies, and in 7 of those 10, the CEO had TRIF or TRIR objectives in his variable comp. And until that can be addressed, we certainly can't get away from it completely. But really, that's the challenge. You got to get to the compensation committee of the board really to change that. But that's not to say that the organization can't also do in parallel something sensible. And also, I want to caution everybody that you have to continue to monitor these traditional metrics, because if they do start to, if you do start to see an excursion outside the control lines on your TRIF or your TRIR, then there's something needs to be done. That's telling you something. But if you can maintain your rolling 12-month or what have you within your control boundaries, then you're fine. But I would advocate that you're talking about doing something in parallel to that.
Let me add a couple of points to that as well, Norman. And that is, I believe as HSE professionals, it's incumbent upon us to educate our VPs and our C-suite, and eventually then our board of directors, because we're not going to see that change unless you start to educate them. And if you're looking at your lagging indicators as truly lagging indicators of the processes you're implementing, you're going to need the key performance indicators to set it up so that you can actually create the results that you want, which is the outcomes. And if you've got the proper key performance indicators, you really will see a cultural change and an eventual change to that. And we know from from our human performance side of things, it's anywhere from 5 to 7 years to really structure a cultural change. So how quickly we can get that done will really depend on the organization, but don't expect it to happen overnight, and expect the results from that.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Rick. I mean, one of the things that we have to accept is that when we've got to the kind of performance levels that the first poll results indicated that the participants here are in, then the low-hanging fruit is all gone. And so we're going to have to be a lot more nuanced, a lot more sophisticated in our approach to stuff, and start to think in much longer time horizons, because the easy fixes are done. The quick fixes are done.
Any
Okay, so
thoughts? Just a question there on, I certainly have had a few inquiries from companies in the industry asking about TRIF and challenges with TRIF, namely in relation to small employers, and some of the difficulties that creates where they have one incident that basically makes them essentially unemployable comparatively to other companies. Do you have any thoughts on that, and maybe the history of OSHA? Because I know OSHA's done some stuff historically, sort of what the intention of TRIF was that maybe is not, people aren't aware of.
Sure, and we're actually misusing this. The idea originally, or the concept upon which these things are based, is so that the government can make industry to industry comparisons so that they know which industries they need to concentrate on to reduce threat to life and limb. And what's happened is that we've kind of bastardized this whole thing, and we now take it to the ridiculous extent that we do, where we're looking at, one workover rigs TRIR, which is just nonsensical from a statistical perspective. And that's one of the other reasons these things are not going to go away, because they do still have value at the kind of macro level, but we are misusing them terribly. Sorry, that was a bit of a rant. I may have lost the plot of the question.
Oh, that's okay.
So
we have one more question here. I don't know, Rick, if you can read that out maybe, or.
sure. And this one is from Jeff, and he just this one is actually towards you, Robert. It says, what are some courses offered by the Energy Safety Canada to get a better understanding and training on some type of measurements that we discussed today?
Well, so this is sort of an interesting sort of political sort of question, really, but I mean, appreciate it. The reality is that we have courses that talk about metrics, and certainly part of the core program. But I mean that core process is we're working the government and a variety of other certifying partners to basically revise some of that stuff. So that's going to take some time. Really, at this point, when you talk about the metrics and new ideas, you're being part of this session is really where that sits. And keep in mind, I mean. Energy Safety Canada is represents everyone at all sort of stages of the sort of continuum on their journey too, right? So we probably do need to wrap up just because we're going to lose some people here, but I think we can handle maybe this next question just after I turn off the recording. So maybe if we can just hold on to that for a minute. Just a couple things to go through here. We have some upcoming webinars, a variety of them. There's this Alberta Job Grant, September 21st. I'd encourage employers to take a look at that if you haven't. There's some definite opportunities for some funding for training that are going to be discussed there. A variety of core ones as well. I've only listed the one on emergency response. There's an in-vehicle monitoring systems and human performance at the end of the month by Emerson Close from Chevron. And then we have Can We Talk, a mental health discussion with the folks from Movember on October the 6th, and energy-based fire prevention on October the 7th. And so we do have some feedback. You guys will have seen this sent out to your inbox. Please fill it out. Give us some feedback. That's how we improve, talking about continuous improvement. And I'd like to thank, obviously, Norman and Rick for putting in the time, on this day, but as well as over the last 3 sessions to really help industry and move some of these conversations forward. And at this point, I'll stop recording, and then we can answer a few additional questions.